To watch my exclusive content not featured anywhere on YouTube, log on to my website at imjustheretomakeyouthink.com/films.
Would suggest that Negroes vote for in the coming election?
I wouldn't suggest that they vote for any party or either party. Either party. I would suggest that the so-called Negroes become politically mature, realize the power that they hold in the field of politics, and then once the person who is running is aware that this man is awakened to the power that he holds, then that person who is running will approach that Negro on a more intelligent plane. As it is right now, most of the Negro leaders sell out. Most of the Negro leaders sell out.
There's a lot of messages going out about this election. First and foremost, anybody telling you that you gotta vote, that it's your duty, that you have to exercise the right, and that people died for you to vote. For one, people did die, but nobody walked out their house to go die for you to vote. They were killed by probably some racists that don't want to see us get anything. Well, I'm saying that to say this. Be skeptical of anybody telling you to vote and not telling you to ask for anything, or to tell you to just vote and not to get anything for your vote. That's not how it works. That's not the process. You don't vote just to vote. You vote because you're getting something, or your community is getting something. So everybody that's telling you that, man, look at them and say, what are you getting? Because people that just want you to vote and not ask for nothing, people that's in power that want you to vote but don't want you to get anything, or not asking for you to get anything economically, they suspect, straight up. Because a lot of people been in place for a long time and we ain't got shit. That shit gonna end. That shit gonna end. We gonna get what we supposed to get. Period. Period. Period.
Mr. Carmichael, do you see any change in atmosphere in the South? Do you think that we are approaching a more militant or revolutionary stage in the civil rights movement in the South?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think we're moving now into a political arena. And I think that what Negroes are now tampering in, what they're tampering with, will touch the entire country. To be very precise, for example, many Negroes who have registered to vote have been evicted from their lands in Lowndes County. People who have worked on plantations for 35, 40 years, because they've registered to vote, have been evicted.
Any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a chump. A political chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you are dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race. Do they come up with? They try and pass the buck to the Dixiecrats. Now, back during the days when you were blind, deaf, and dumb, ignorant, politically immature, naturally you went along with that. But today, as your eyes come open and you develop political maturity, you're able to see and think for yourself. And you can see that a Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat in disguise.
OCO, everyone. This is a very interesting time indeed that we are experiencing firsthand, with all of these distractions flooding the airwaves of frequencies that millions of people have since become accustomed to having, based solely on the pains of needing convenience, and or maybe those strangers selling their illusions of providing you a peace of mind, some way, somehow. And how convenient is it that we are approaching the time for people to allegedly participate with voting in the next president of the United States? And I say allegedly, not because of the damn gimmick. It's based on the fact that transparency within and throughout the voting system itself is non-existent. I mean, do you really know for sure, or are you assuming what you believe may happen after you cast in your vote? Some people's reactions are allowing themselves to believe in something unforeseen, as if it's actual reality based on common knowledge. In this sense, the word common is used to represent an equal agreement between parties on uncontested grounds. So this means that common knowledge serves as indoctrinated information agreed upon by complete strangers, being as though common knowledge is blindly accepted by many as the norm, without challenging its accuracy or validity on whether or not it has any truth to stand on. So since the word know is in knowledge and the word lie is in belief, why is it not considered common knowledge to know for sure about something versus believing that it could make sense? Like, for example, some of you may recall hearing the phrase 400 years of slavery at some point during this year, or maybe last year, or maybe 5 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago. And did you notice how that 400 number has never changed?
Let's get into the inner workings and the meaning of this. Let's get into the inner workings and the meaning of a black revolution and why black people have a right to take what's theirs. You can read the platform in the program. It's a basic program, and it simply says exactly what black people have been crying for 400 years. 400 years. 400 years.
Maybe you chose to believe the 400 years of slavery story starts during the year 1492 and reoccurring up until the year 1865, when slavery was allegedly abolished. But that equates to just 373 years. Now, let's say that you'll start that 400 years of slavery number during the year 1619, when the first so-called Negro slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. But if you stopped at 1865, that would equate to just 246 years. In fact, America's Declaration of Independence was approaching its 90th anniversary at that time. So this means that the American government as we know it is literally only 244 years old as of right now, being the year 2020. Unless these anonymous writers of these glorified fairy tales that you call history were referring to the year 2019 from the year 1619. Then you would notice why that 400 number hasn't changed since you became aware of that negative affirmation in the first place. This is why it is important to be cognizant of the difference between believing and knowing. Ever since we began to see people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X appearing on national media stations and television programs alike, protesting and campaigning for many call to action purposes, you would see those same tactics utilized today, but in a much more provocative sense. And here's what I mean by that. Protesting and marching and the consistent need to vote for a political representative was assembled and heavily campaigned by both parties of the political spectrum. And the copper-colored people were manipulated into believing that their vote will count towards something positive for their own benefit, and things will be changed for the better good for their community's sake. But that promise has been made over and over and over again. And look at what happens. You see how your voice doesn't count when it comes to yelling for justice, right? Now just ask yourself, why would you believe that your vote counts as if it'll actually change anything for the better? Think history isn't telling you otherwise? Now, we can recall learning in school about how our ancestors were not allowed the right to vote until the passing of the 15th Amendment, which was ratified February 3rd, 1870. And according to the National Archives and Records Administration, on pages 61 and 62 of the milestone documents of 1995, the so-called Negroes, quote, exercised the franchise and held office in many southern states through the 1880s. But in the early 1890s, steps were taken to ensure subsequent white supremacy. Literacy tests for the vote, grandfather clauses, excluding from the franchise all whose ancestors had not voted in the 1860s, and other devices to disenfranchise African Americans were written into the constitutions of former Confederate states. End quote. I would like for you to note this portion of the quote where it says, exercised the franchise and held office in many southern states. Because this is how you know that our ancestors were prospering as capitalists in this society during this time period, being as though they were able to run businesses, create franchises, hold elections, and office as a franchiser. Each business can elect one who is chosen, or they may select one who is handpicked to take an office or employment, meaning that the business can either elect or select its president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer, just to name a few things as an example. But somehow this phrase was merged into moving from business to more of a political sense, to the point where the definition of franchise is now being associated with both the right to vote in public elections and an authorization granted by a government or company to an individual or group, enabling them to carry out specified commercial activities. with the franchisor being the person or company that grants a franchise and the franchisee being the person or company doing business under the name or mark of another franchise. It is an elaborate agreement under which the franchisee does business in accordance with methods and procedures prescribed by the franchisor. A collective bargaining agreement should ring a bell here, which is nothing more than a legal binding contract. I share more about that here. Those of you that might not know, for starters, collective bargaining is the process of negotiating the terms of employment between an employer and a group of promising employees. A collective bargaining agreement is a formally written, legally enforceable contract that could be valid up until any written specified time period between the owner or equivalent decision makers of an organization and its employees represented by an independent trade union. Sounding familiar at all to you yet? Let's take things a step further. Listen closely. According to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, the noun bargain is defined as, quote, an agreement between parties concerning the sale of property, or a contract by which one party binds himself to transfer the right to some property for a consideration, and the other party binds himself to receive the property and pay the consideration, end quote. It goes on to say that the verb bargain means to make a contract or conclusive agreement, often with for before the thing purchased, as to bargain for a house. A bargained with B for his farm, end quote. So with all of that being said, we can determine that the CBA that's being held by the Indian child represents a binding labor contract, or also known as an indenture of servitude, which is known nowadays as an application for employment or a work for hire agreement. And what was this bargain, you ask? Well, who else was promised lots of things only once they have completed cultivating America from the ground up, like acres of land, for example, and they never received them? According to the International Franchise Association, under the title Foundations of Franchising, it states, quote, every franchise relationship is founded on the mutual commitment of both parties to fulfill their obligations under the franchise agreement. Each party will fulfill its obligations, will act consistently with the interests of the brand, and will not act as to harm the brand and system. This willing interdependence between franchisors and franchisees, and the trust and honesty upon which it is founded, has made franchising a worldwide success as a strategy for business growth, end quote. In which all of this should make you wonder, could it be possible that once a person signs up to vote, then that individual has now consented to entering into a legal binding contract inadvertently?
Mr. Carmichael, do you see any change in atmosphere in the South? Do you think that we are approaching a more militant or revolutionary stage in the civil rights movement in the South?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think we're moving now into a political arena. And I think that what Negroes are now tampering in, what they're tampering with, will touch the entire country. To be very precise, for example, many Negroes who have registered to vote have been evicted from their lands in Lowndes County. People who have worked on plantations for 35, 40 years because they've registered to vote have been evicted. So that raises a philosophical question, not only for us, but for the whole country. Can property-less people be made as equal as property owners through the vote?
A legal binding contract that purposely removes certain constitutional rights away from you, that in turn forces an individual to fulfill obligations and act consistently with the interests of the brand that they choose or were forced to do business with. This is uncommonly known as the evolution of slavery, since steps were taken in the early 1890s to ensure subsequent white supremacy by the formal use of devices like literacy tests and grandfather clauses to ensure the disenfranchisement of the American Indians as young children. The word devices is used here in reference to a plan or a scheme or some type of trick with a particular aim. Literacy tests is being tied to voting only, but during the 1890s, you saw the establishment of HBCUs, and the literacy test became a mandatory requisite in order to achieve an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, as an example, in which this piece of paper acknowledges just how much of an excellent worker or employee you have gradually become. So the question remains, who exactly are the franchisers? And then while we're at it, who exactly are the franchisees? Looking back at it all now, you may recall noticing that during each presidential election, from Abraham Lincoln and beyond, substantial amounts of precedents will arise, conveniently aligning with the time period given to cast your votes in for the next president. These precedents will take place in order to capture the attention of one's mindset by moving the individual emotionally to the point where whatever precedents took place and was heavily promoted by the media to the public, it eventually propels one's decision to act in emergency response to that precedent, driving the individual straight to the polls in order to emotionally cast their votes in as the end result. I'll give you an example here that you would least expect to be one. Taking it back to the time period when the phrase Black Power was initially used.
We want Black Power. We want Black Power. We want Black Power.
The Neegies that were living throughout the North and especially the southernmost regions of America, aka Turtle Island, all fell victim to unprecedented acts of racial discrimination, especially when it came to regaining political powers they once had on a congressional level during the late 1870s. The 15th Amendment was ratified during the year 1870, which prohibited the states from denying any male U.S. citizen the right to vote based on, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, by the time the Neegies sought to fill up those newly created political vacancies, particular people associated with the Dixiecrats, or rather known as the Democrats, conducted devious tactics against the Neegies, to say the least, to not only completely erase their reputations and representations in the political realm, but also icing their rights to vote against it all, by discounting their votes to just merely political jargon that eventually became campaign material or another form of entertainment over the years. So it wasn't until 95 years later, when the initial Voting Rights Act was signed into law by then President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965, that forced the state governments to finally participate with previously enacted federal laws that allowed for the so-called Negroes to have the right to vote. So now, with this brand new allowance from the government finally afforded to the Neegies, both Republicans and the Democrats had to act fast with gaining the trust of the so-called Negro communities, and especially in the South. So what does a politician do when he or she wants to win an election with your votes? It's simple, really. They'll just play with your emotions. James Howard Meredith was the name used for a second time in American history to steer one's emotions into a false sense of needing some type of political emergency relief. The first time, then 29-year-old James Meredith was instructed by someone to attempt to desegregate the University of Mississippi by attending as a student during the year 1962. It was said to have led to a race riot, causing 2 unnamed deaths and some 160 U.S. Marshals and 40 National Guardsmen were wounded somehow. But with multiple race riots occurring throughout this time period already, this particular precedent was regarded as, quote, a pivotal moment in history of civil rights in the U.S. by the Department of Justice Project. James graduated in '63 with a degree in political science. He then continued his education all the way in Nigeria at the University of Ibadan. I could be mispronouncing that. Then he returned to the US 2 years later in 1965, and then out of nowhere, James Meredith randomly launches his March Against campaign, where he's back in the spotlight again for yet another political precedent. But this time around, the pot thickens, being as though he became a victim of an attempted murder, or so the story claims. During a very hot summer on the date of June 6, 1966, according to the National Archives, James Meredith set out to march from Memphis, Tennessee, some 220 miles straight to Jackson, Mississippi, with an African walking stick in one hand and a Bible in another, all by himself with nobody in attendance for support nor verification. But his goal was to, quote, inspire Negroes to register and go to the polls. But without any media presence, the internet, or any outcries of support for his cause, how difficult could it be for James Meredith to inspire people to go out and vote? It would be like trying to start a car on an empty tank. So that could only mean that a miracle must happen in order for people to even see what Meredith was attempting to do here. It was said that on the second day of his alleged one-man march, a very small group of unnamed people and a few journalists joined James just outside of Hernando, Mississippi. And a little after 4 p.m. during a hot summer afternoon, 2 photographers that just so happened to be sitting on the side of the road waiting for Coca-Cola to be delivered to them from a third photographer noticed James Meredith in their rearview mirror, marching up the side of the road behind them on the left side shoulder of US 51. According to documents held by the National Archives from the Department of Justice, a white male appeared on the scene by the name of Aubrey James Norvell, shouting out loud, "I just want James Meredith." Then he blasts a 12-gauge shotgun towards James, allegedly striking him in the head, neck, back, and leg. Contradicting reports claimed that he was shot by sniper bullets. And I must admit that it's great news, but it's also odd that he somehow survived. But besides all of that, how convenient was it for photographers and journalists to be there just in time to witness this entire precedent taking place? And if things can't be any more rendered, it was said that the shooter literally sat on the side of the road and waited patiently for the police to arrive and arrest him. Aubrey was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but 3 of those years were mysteriously waived for him. And with all of that being said, the miracle was achieved. Visual messages of James Meredith's scene, quote, ran in nearly every newspaper and magazine across the country. In one photo, Meredith screams out in pain from the blast of shotgun pellets torn into his back and head as he crawls across the highway, according to the Clarion Ledger. This exposes that the civil rights movement depended strictly on visual images for political effectiveness, which came with many pros and cons. And here's what I mean by that. In the book entitled For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights, author Maurice Berger writes, quote, "It was not just through political or legal writing, but also through compelling images that the civil rights movement altered perception about race and thus advanced the case of black legitimacy within white America. Photographs of the brutality, intensity, and exigency of black Americans' struggle for racial equality appeared in great numbers in newspapers and magazines in the 1960s. The golden age of visual media in the country. White America could no longer ignore the ugliness of what was taking place. By placing the question of civil rights front and center, the mainstream press, intentionally or otherwise, forged a path through which this imagery could enter the minds and hearts of many Americans." End quote. Republican Senator Jacob Jarvis of New York said, "I know of nothing which has more keened the American people to the moral implications of the struggle for civil rights than the photographs which the American press and magazines have shown of actual events on the Southern Front. Political activism in the South led to political action in Washington." The three photographers that were on the scene were Vernon Merritt III, who was freelancing for Life magazine, veteran wire service photographers Jack Thornell and Sammy Parrish of United Press International and the Associated Press, along with news media reporter Tom Jarrell and cameraman Chuck Ferris of ABC News were all in attendance. All of this media coverage was conveniently present for Meredith's one-man march to be presented to the public as breaking news, all just to stroke your emotions to make you register and vote. I'm just here to make you think.